It is our pleasure to welcome Mike Vaccaro to the show, longtime columnist at the New York Post. And apologies for this, if this is maybe embarrassing to me. I've known your work for many years, but I didn't know you were a Bonner guy. And Bulldog helped set this up. And he's in town. Mike McDonald, we know Mike from many years ago. So great occasion for you to be here at your alma mater and the announcement of the new coach.
Yeah, it really was, guys. Look, I mean, I've literally known Mike McDonald from my first day at Bonaventure. He was like the third guy that I met my first day freshman year.
Wow.
I wandered into the Butler gym, and he was there shooting some hoops, and that's how I met him. And that was only about 41 years ago or so.
It's annoying how young he looks.
It really is. It drives you crazy, right? I mean, he looked 12 when I knew him then. I think now he looks 15. And so that's when people have told me, about Mike McDonald, a little long in the tooth. I'm like, well, maybe, but no, he's not. He's literally the youngest man of that age that I know, and I think he's going to do a great job. I think it was an inspired hire. I don't have to repeat his resume with what he did at Damon and what he did at Madai, and he had some great years at Canisius also. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it was exactly the right guy at the right time, and I can't wait to see what happens. I really can't.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Have you had a good visit so far?
Yeah, it was terrific. Look, believe it or not, I'm actually back home. I was up and back in about a day and a half.
All right.
But I got a lot accomplished yesterday. I went to the press conference. It was a wonderful confluence of events, and then I had a book event on campus, and then I had a book event in town, and now I'm back trying to do my day job. Every now and again I got to remember that I have to pay my mortgage also, so I have to write about the Knicks tonight. But that's good. It's all good. It's good to be busy. It beats the alternative, right?
Yeah, right. Well, we're excited to talk to you about your new book, The Bosses of the Bronx. And I was wondering where to start with this. You tend to want to start at the beginning. And I recently, Mike, becoming somewhat of a Watergate buff, learned how George Steinbrenner was infamous, if that's not too strong a word, before he owned the Yankees. I mean, I was a little kid when he was the boss at that point. But watching I think it was Peacock, the special, the documentary, Joel Sherman's in it on the Yankees.
Mm-hmm.
There's a shot from Billy Martin's funeral, and it's Steinbrenner, Mantle, and Nixon sitting together at the funeral. So,
it sure was. I mean, Nixon famously told Billy Martin Jr., who was very upset, of course, that day, to look out at the crowds outside of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And, of course, they'd filled St. Patrick's Cathedral, and there were thousands of people outside. And he said, look at how many people loved your father. And, of course, that made Billy Martin Jr. still talks about that moment. And, that's not possible if not for the friendship between Nixon and Steinbrenner.
Yeah, right.
I really like the early because I'm 8 years old, I think, when he buys the Yankees. So I like any sports fan that paid any attention to baseball, I soon got to know all about him and all of the stuff that is detailed in the book and has been written about and talked about for decades here. Just the personalities that were there. Well, I loved the very beginning, like the backstory on him getting involved and how the front person at the initial news conference at the restaurant is doesn't know how quickly he's going to be pushed aside. And I had no idea. I forget the gentleman's name now. Is it Mitchell? I can't remember the name. You can tell us. But I just had no idea about that. Here's this guy thinks he's going to be the front person for this new group. And within days, Steinbrenner had already just get out of here. Yeah,
it really was that way. Michael Burke was the guy's name. It was funny. He was kind of the face of CBS when CBS owned the team, and it wasn't a very good tenureship for CBS, to say the least. But he helped put together the group that was including Steinbrenner, and in Burke's idea was that he was going to be the guy running things, and Steinbrenner was going to be the silent partner back in Cleveland. And of course, that's what Steinbrenner said on day one too, which turned out to be I don't know, either the biggest lie in sports history or the biggest irony in sports history, because he was anything but an absentee owner. But look, the Yankees had one foot out the door when Steinbrenner's group bought the team. They were, either going to New Jersey, New Orleans was trying to get involved because they were building the Superdome, and it was a real rough time around the Yankees. The ballpark was falling down, and Steinbrenner. The reason why Steinbrenner got the team, without the highest bid, was he promised William Paley, the CBS chairman, that he wouldn't leave New York and follow the Giants to New Jersey. And Pelé bought that. Pelé already knew he was going to go down as the guy who helped the Yankees kind of go sideways. He didn't want to be known as the guy that allowed them to leave town. And guys, it's funny. There's actually a part that didn't make the book. It didn't make the final cut, but will be interesting to you. Is that they're around here January 3rd? It was almost a national holiday because that's when Steinbrenner bought the team, and it was kind of a surprise. But a couple of days before that, as legend has it, he was a regular at the Round Table, the old great restaurant and bar in Buffalo, kind of the Toots Shore of Buffalo. And word is that he was telling some of his cronies in the bar he was going to buy the Yankees. Of course, they all dismissed him. The kind of the lies that men tell in bars, right?
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, 3 days later, there he is on the podium talking about the Yankees. So George always had a great affinity for Buffalo, but he had a greater affinity for George Steinbrenner. He loved the idea of Steinbrenner owning the Yankees, and he lived it with gusto for 37 years to follow. Steinbrenner
was a Cleveland guy. So maybe he felt, Buffalo might have felt like home to him in some sort of certain way. We feel that way about Cleveland a little bit, kind of like going through not quite sports hell, Bulldog, that's too strong, but in the last 40, 50 years, they're kind of our cousins.
I felt attached to them when LeBron finally got them an NBA title.
Yeah.
I know that, I felt like I can feel you people. I feel like I am you people. So
yeah, you were happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a Rust Belt brotherhood there, but it's funny. He actually spent a lot of time in Buffalo when he was a shipbuilder because it was one of the Steinbrenner family ships that pretty much helped take down the Michigan Avenue Bridge in 1959. So he had to be back in town a lot for various lawsuits and so forth. And
yes.
That's the reason why he got involved in the Round Table, because he always wanted a place like he fancied himself a guy who'd go to Toots Shore, for instance, a big bar in New York, and get a table. And of course, he was never able to do that, but he could certainly do it in Buffalo, where he was a presence and he was known. So that was kind of what he did.
Interesting. Mike Vaccaro with us. The book is called The Bosses of the Bronx. Mike Schopp and the Bulldog here on WGR. One of my favorite stories in the book is the first one, where you talk about an interaction which was early in your relationship with him, when he calls you, it's 3:30 in the morning on the West Coast, and you're like, you wanted to talk to me, here's your chance, and how you held your own in that conversation. Curious for how you sort of remember that. And then from that, Mike, and the days forward, not that this is necessarily easy to do, but to try to put him in perspective. I mean, I'm not sure who in sports now really is that similar to Steinbrenner. It seems like maybe, not like that anymore.
He's a one-of-one guy. He really is. I mean, look, there have been other high-profile owners, Jerry Jones obviously says a lot of silly things, and Mark Cuban used to give press conferences from his exercise bike and all that stuff. But, I mean, the guy who was probably closest to him was Al Davis. He was also a friend of Steinbrenner's. They were both born on the same day, July the 4th, and it was a year apart. Al Davis was a year older. And it's interesting because that's actually the reason why I was trying to reach out to Steinbrenner and the story you talk about. Now, I talked to George a bunch when I was in the New York Star Ledger because he was involved in the Nets and the Devils also. They had a brief merger. So I was around him in group settings and stuff. But once I got the job at the Post, I realized, it's time to really develop a relationship with this guy. And it's always kind of a rite of passage, or it was, for a lot of guys who showed up in New York and wanted to cover baseball, wanted to cover the Yankees, and it was getting George on the phone. And that was always a challenge the first time because, he would pick and choose who he wanted to call and call back. And so I was trying to pursue George for a while to do a story about his friendship with Davis. I was at the Super Bowl when the Raiders were playing the Chargers, they were playing the Buccaneers, in San Diego. And, 3:37 in the morning, my phone rings. And, of course, before you answer the phone, you're wondering who's dead or is my house burning down, because why else are getting a call at that time in the morning? And it was Steinbrenner, and he said, "You sound like you've been sleeping." And I said, "Well, I have been, George. It's 3:30 in the morning." And he said, "No, I'm not here. It's 6:30 in Tampa. It's beautiful and sunny. I'm going to work. What do you want?" And, of course, that's part of the beauty about Steinbrenner, right? I just tried to give you a Steinbrenner impression, but that wasn't the real Steinbrenner voice. That was the Larry David Steinbrenner voice, which everybody really knows, right? But, or at least my attempt at the Larry David Steinbrenner voice. But, and so that alone tells you what kind of a guy he was. I mean, he was a spinning top from the moment he woke up every day of his life because he had a million ideas. And, the perspective that I would bring to the book is this. I mean, I've been asked this a lot. Why did you write about Steinbrenner? There's been a million words written about Steinbrenner. He's had a couple of, really complete biographies written. And honestly, I deal with a lot of Yankees, younger Yankees fans, readers, people I just talk baseball with. And a lot of them, anybody who's under the age of 35, 40, they don't remember the George who was a little bit crazy, a lot controversial, very flamboyant in the 70s and the 80s, who was an everyday presence in New York baseball existence. They remember the older guy who would show up at Yankee Stadium and get cheered. They don't remember the guy who would show up at the same building 10 years earlier and get booed, and his name would be chanted with one unprintable name before it or one unprintable name after it. And it was a challenge to me to kind of introduce these generations of people to what Steinbrenner was, And I think even guys of our generation, I think we're about the same age, a lot of times these guys use selective amnesia because what they prefer to remember is the Steinbrenner at the end, and not the Steinbrenner who drove him to drink in the 70s and 80s, which he did a lot of the time.
One of the things I enjoyed thinking about that sprang from, breezing through the book, Mike, is that so many of the stories are so familiar to me. As a Red Sox fan, and, even in Buffalo, there's plenty of Yankee fans here. And I think we tend to think, like, one thought I had was to wonder what the Yankee, all the drama with Reggie and Billy Martin and George, of course, would have been like in, like, nowadays with the viral videos and TikTok and Twitter and all the stuff. But it strikes me like in Buffalo, New York, I mean, I didn't know every detail. That's what your book is for, and others like it. But I knew all those stories were viral enough. Like, I knew it from the newspaper and from watching, the game of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I wanted to do. I realized that a lot of people would know the stories, the famous one's a born liar, the other's convicted story, and I'm the story that served the drink. But there was a challenge to me to try and kind of just find some more stories behind those stories. And when you try and make it a George-specific version of those stories, that allows you to really find different aspects of that story. And that's kind of what I was really looking to do. And, I think that's what I ultimately was able to pull off, I hope. But yeah, look, I mean, there's two things about that too. I mean, people ask, well, what would George do in an age of Twitter? And my answer is, take a look what the president does. He's on social media an awful lot, and I think George would be on 10 times as much because he would love the idea that he could get his message across faster, quicker, and not have to rely on guys like me to get it done. That's genuinely how I think that he would have responded to being in this kind of age where it's instant gratification and instant messaging.
Yeah, it feels like maybe George Steinbrenner's Twitter feed would be like drinking out of a fire hose. It would just constant.
It wouldn't surprise me if George one of these days, jumped onto a table in a parking lot somewhere, because he was a football guy and he had football in his blood. And like I said before, he had a real affinity for Buffalo. And so I know that he'd probably be delighted by what's come to pass with the Bills becoming so good the last couple of years. And he really kind of, not always for the good. I mean, I think part of the problem with baseball today is a lot of baseball fans look at it like a football game. And you just, you can stress over 17 football games. You try and do that over 162 baseball games, you're going to drive yourself crazy. And that's what George did. I mean, he dreamed of the 162-0 season. That was, of course, never going to happen, but that didn't mean he couldn't want one.
Right. With Mike Vaccaro for a few more minutes here on WGR, the most incredible phase or section of Steinbrenner's years as the Yankee owner for me is the Winfield stuff. I mean, to Bulldog's point about what we kind of know about him or knew about him growing up, Reggie Jackson, feuding with Reggie, feuding with Billy Martin, firing him and hiring him over again every 5 times. I mean, that stuff is more common knowledge. From that documentary and your book, like the Winfield stuff is just completely surreal. You mentioned the Bills indirectly. Terry Pagula, who is absolutely not interested in the spotlight, like he's the opposite. They have a press conference after Sean McDermott is fired, and for 2026, Pagula, we kind of thought really stepped in it, talking about Bills player Keon Coleman. Like, no, the coaches wanted him. And just like that's maybe this generation's version of something bordering on incredible for an owner to say. But Mike, I mean, the story, you could go on forever about Steinbrenner and Winfield. I think having an owner just so brazenly, openly critical of a star player on his own team. It'd be like if Pagula just had signs in the suite every week, fire Keon Coleman or something like that. It's just like hard to believe, Winfield.
Guys, you nailed it. Really, that's a great story to bring up because if you want to really illustrate just what it was like, what Steinbrenner was like, think about this. So I was asked by somebody not long ago. I think I went on campus yesterday, and they said, refresh my memory. Why did he get suspended the second time? Didn't he hire a private eye or something to dig up dirt on Winfield? And I laughed and I said, all right, think about that, and think about how crazy that would be. Now let me tell you what really happened. It wasn't a private eye. It was a guy out of a Damon Runyon play named Howie Spira, who basically owed his life to the five families of the New York mob, who was desperate for money, and who basically gave George, information for $40,000. This is who George Steinbrenner used, by the way, to ruin his best player, to blackmail his best player. It's insane. It's literally insane. That's what it was. So the crazy story you thought it was is actually 10 times nuttier. And that's exactly how it happened. I mean, a lot of times I had to read this stuff 2 and 3 times over because I just couldn't believe this can't be true, but it was exactly true. It was 100% real. And to me, that's why there's really nobody else to compare. Look, you talked about the Pagula incident, right? I mean, that's probably considered, oh my God, that's the day that the Bills almost had a complete meltdown because the owner said something off the grid a little bit. That was a Tuesday around the Yankees with Steinbrenner.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was Tuesday. And on Wednesday, there was something even crazier. And on Thursday, you probably wouldn't even know how to put it into words. That's honestly what life with George was like. And the only thing I regret, guys, is that I'm too young to have actually been around for Apex George. Look, the version of George I got was heading toward the one that became more beloved, that was starting to win. And, winning is such a great deodorizer, right? I mean, as long as you win, nobody cares about the owner when they win. They only want to complain about the owners when they lose. They're looking for scapegoats, and everybody then says the owner doesn't care enough. They don't care enough about it as I do. But look, that's one thing that Yankee fans never wondered about George Steinbrenner. He sometimes cared too much.
Yeah, you weren't there for the early stuff like you just said. I wonder, have you thought at all? We've kind of covered it, I guess, whether or not someone with that kind of personality could fly in today's sports world.
I don't think so. Only because, you know what, it's just everything. People are so cautious now because they're raised that way. George was able to be himself because that's how he was in his business dealings. It's how he was as a baseball owner. I mean, right now, Hal Steinbrenner, basically, he's our age. He's come of age at a time when you know enough to be cautious, especially if you have a famous face and a famous last name. You just never know who's got a camera pointed at you. You never know who's got a live mic somewhere, and that could be the difference between having a successful time as an owner and then wind up on page 6 and not page 1 in the vernacular of the New York Post. And so I think people are just, because of that, they're just so overly cautious now. You're not allowed to really express yourself in ways that Steinbrenner does. And look, even somebody like Jerry Jones who doesn't seem bothered by it, the fact of the matter is if you're not going to win once every 30 years, no one's really going to care what you have to say about it. You're just going to be a silly old man rambling in clouds. And that's kind of where Jerry Jones is. So, just a very unique personality and a very unique time. And look, I know, especially people in Buffalo roll their eyes when people in New York talk about stuff like this, but it's different in New York because, you have the tabloids and you have the back pages, and they were always at war in those days. So it was always going to be in the news, and that's just a unique situation, Yeah. Like Al Davis, I think if Al Davis had ever owned the Jets or the Giants, he might have been similar to George in that regard because he would have had the back pages to use as an ally or an enemy. And he didn't have that in Oakland or in L.A. where he was. There just aren't back pages there. It's a very unique element to New York, and George knew how to play those both back pages like a Stradivarius.
Mike, last thing before you go. The title is The Bosses of the Bronx, plural. Hal Steinbrenner, his legacy is tracking toward what? Yankee fans complain about not spending enough, and maybe your point about as a compliment, knowing to stay out of the spotlight isn't everybody's favorite thing about an owner, especially a Steinbrenner. So I don't know. What's your opinion of how Yankee fans perceive him and where it's going?
Look, every time the Yankees go on a couple of games, they've lost 2 in a row. I guarantee you, when I hang in with you guys and go on my phone, there'll be 3 Yankee fans wanting the fire Cashman, wanting Hal to sell the team. And he understands that that's out there. He understands people think, well, what will my father do? He's never thought of being George's son as a burden. He always calls it a privilege. He thinks it's a civic duty for the Steinbrenner family to make the Yankees a competitive team every year, and all that stuff is true. But the fact of the matter is that fans only care about winning and losing. And to Yankees fans, you can call them spoiled, but the reason why they're spoiled is because they have a mission statement about winning a championship or bust. And guess who wrote that mission statement? It was George Steinbrenner. So, Hal can't exactly complain about that because that's what he inherited. That's what he has.
Literally.
And but the thing of it is, I mean, look, his dad didn't have to go up against the limitless pockets of the Dodgers or the Blue Jays, or even in his own city. Steve Cohen, is a one-man show, but he's got $24 billion of his own money. Al doesn't have that. The Yankees as a whole don't have that. And, when George was building the Yankees as the dominant team in town over the Mets had an owner in Lorinda de Roulet who would, ask why they couldn't throw the foul balls back so they could wash them and use them tomorrow. Mets fans can complain about Steve Cohen, but he's not doing that. And that's what Hal has to deal with every day, and George just didn't have to do that. And I think that's a big difference also.
I have one Yankee fan friend who lives in the tri-state. He is unbelievable. To Mike's point about messages on his phone, This guy, I see him once a year for a fantasy draft in Philadelphia. I don't know anybody like him. Everything is the worst.
Yeah.
Everything is the worst, always.
It's hilarious because, Yankees fans down here usually have friends who are Mets fans too. And I've always wanted to ask these Yankees fans, how about you ask your buddies who are Mets fans how much they wouldn't mind being in the playoffs every year, winning 93, 94, 95 games every year like the Yankees.
Right.
Ask them ask them if they wouldn't mind signing up for that. I bet you they would. I bet you most teams in baseball would.
Crazy. Well, it's so nice to have chatted with you, Mike. We may have done this 20 years ago in different places, Bulldog and I, but when Bulldog mentioned in the book and this opportunity, we were both really excited about it. The Bosses of the Bronx from Mike Vaccaro, our guests here today on WGR. Thank you, Mike. Good luck.
Guys, thank you so much. I hope you guys have a nice long run with the Sabres because that'll be a lot of fun stuff to talk about the next couple of months, hopefully.
Yes.
For sure. Thank you.
Thanks for that. That would be great. Mike Vaccaro, again, the Bosses of the Bronx.